There's so many funny stories about him, but one of the things that sort of sticks in my mind now is the way he used to say mum all the time. Mum, mum, mum. And there'd always be, you know, like lots and lots of mums, and I'd sort of say, what? What do you want? And we'd get caught up in this where he'd just say mum, and I'd be saying, what do you want? And I'd finish it off by saying, do you like Laurie's mum?
If mum made him do the dishwasher, he'd like, his talking would be very about mum, but it would be like ridiculous things like she should be put in prison or it's a breach of his human rights and stuff to do the dishwasher.
I'd say, how was school today, like you do to kids, and he once told me that there'd been a knife fight in class, which struck me as unlikely. So I said to him, well, that's terrible, you know, kind of, what did the teacher say? And apparently the teacher just said no knives in class, you know, as opposed to it's okay, like, you know, playground, presumably. He told people that we made him live in the cupboard under the stairs, you know, which was quite amusing.
He was very repetitious. So if he asked you something, he'd see a picture of a bus and he'd be talking about the bus and he'd say, who was the bus driver? And I'd say, well, I don't know. Who was the bus driver? And this would go on for a while, and in the end I'd give up and I'd say, oh, it's Fred Brown. Oh, Fred.
He had a huge appetite. He would eat from morning till night if you let him. You'd only have to see a cake and it would be gone.
Oh, you were the one who always brought the cakes
I brought
in.
the cakes,
So then he'd sort of sit really close to Sue, you know, just to say, I'm your best friend today, Sue. Can I have the cake?
Every time he tells something, he'd be like, why? Just like, when the main question he asked was why. You just have to keep thinking of something to say after it and then just say why again.
I don't think I've ever heard him end and just go, oh, that sounds interesting. It would always be another why, until you finally just went, I don't know, Connor, I can't, I have no idea.
We were in a big family group one day and he went round all the family going, why? And my youngest daughter, his auntie Sam, said to him, for goodness sake, Connor, turn your why box off. And he sort of looked at her and then he understood, and this huge grin across his face. He thought that was so funny.
And he got into this thing about guns, and he told me that his guns were so big that he and his guns couldn't sleep in his bed at the same time. So it was either him with his guns on the floor or his arms in the bed. And crazy images like that.
He'd laugh at the worst jokes for like ages.
He had some good jokes. He always told us just saying jokes, but they're always funny because he told them like the best way.
He was just funny all the time. I mean, he spent one Saturday afternoon making playlists on his iPod, and he did it so carefully. And when I had a look later, he put one song on each playlist, but that's what he wanted to do. So it was funny. Some of the things he did, some of the things he was very funny in what he was doing. He was entertaining, and we don't know whether he was being funny for us. And other things he did were just funny because he sort of crashed through all the rules and did things that other people wouldn't do. And I always liked that. He picked the right rules to break, I think, and sort of showed us how silly we were quite often.
He loved ambulance crews. Every time they came to the house when he'd had a seizure or something, I mean, you know, that was quite a lot of compensation for having had the seizure, was the fact that he got to spend 45 minutes with the paramedics and all their kit, and they were always, you know, always brilliant with him. And he loved that. You know, he just had some particular needs, and as long as you understood his way of looking at the world, you know, he was relatively straightforward to deal with. But in that, when he got to coming towards adulthood and transition into adult services, his behaviour did start to deteriorate quite a lot. He became more difficult and more unhappy. He was clearly unhappy and depressed, I think, but very difficult to explore that with him because of, you know, the issues of his development.
It was awful seeing Connor change his personality so dramatically over the space of a couple of months and become really unreachable in a way that he'd never been before. That was really distressing. He ended up punching his teaching assistant, who he loved, in the face, I think, on the Friday before he went into the unit. And that was, you know, the step that we sort of thought, actually, ironically, this could end up with somebody being seriously hurt here. On the Monday, I assumed, because we'd been really ringing the crisis line, which was a joke, on the Friday, I assumed on the Monday that the cavalry would arrive when everybody was back at work. And in fact, nobody got in touch at all, which was astonishing. And then on the Tuesday, a friend of mine rang and said, I've just been told about a place down the road at Slade.
But we did think, genuinely, that we were doing not only did we feel like we sort of hadn't got much choice because that's where we'd reach, but that, you know, we were probably doing the right thing. You know, we thought he would be in there for a short time, he would be assessed properly, and the assessment would lead to a set of recommendations or suggestions or plans that would help Connor and us, and, as I say, people who had to work with Connor, to kind of provide him with the support that he would need going forward into full adulthood.
We just used to sort of ask what they were doing. I remember sitting in a meeting saying, well, where's the assessment and treatment? And they'd just fob us off. They changed his medication in May time, I think it was April. And Connor was always sensitive to medication change. And I went in to visit him one day, and he was very disorientated and he'd bitten his tongue, and it was obvious to me, as his mum, he'd had a seizure, so I went downstairs and told them, and they'd seen he'd bitten his tongue, but they just thought he'd bitten his tongue, so they'd just given him Bonjela. They hadn't made the connection between biting his tongue and epilepsy. So then I sort of said, you know, you need to do something. He's obviously having seizures. And they made noises about doing things. They ordered an epilepsy monitor. It turned out that they decided he wasn't having seizures. Also turned out they were allowing him to bath unsupervised. And inevitably, you know, with hindsight, we didn't know this at the time, but he ended up drowning, which is absolutely, you know, I cannot believe it. You know, I can't believe he's just died in such a terrible, wasteful, careless, preventable way.
You know, Sarah and I are both absolutely mortified and horrified, and I feel very aggrieved that the behaviour that we and others that we know have encountered through this experience has been so awful, that nobody should have to be going through that experience, particularly after they've had a bereavement of a child. You know, I mean, it's one thing to have a death in the family, which is something you really, really don't want. It's another thing for it to be your child, which, you know, I never expected to. I mean, you worry about so many things when you have kids, of course. You worry about them, you know, car accidents, and you worry about all sorts, you know, them not being happy, them being depressed, maybe they might take drugs, or they might get into a bad fight. And you do worry about a lot of things. And one thing I never really worried about was that one of them would die, you know, while being looked after in an NHS hospital.
It's sad that it has happened to Connor, because Connor was a nice young lad, and his mum and dad just probably feel lost without him.
I don't think they were trained properly. They didn't realise what was wrong with him.
Don't necessarily leave them unattended in the bath if that's what's required, or give them a shower. You know, it's not rocket science.
When Mum made the blog, she kind of came up with names for all of us, and then his was Laughable, obviously, because he laughs a lot. And then that's how he's like referred to, like the campaign and stuff, as Justice for Albie, and like people who tweet and like read the blog will be like, oh, I feel like this about Albie and stuff, and it's kind of just become his sort of persona online.
Well, the LB bills emerged out of the Justice for LB campaign. A sort of small team of, not a team, a small set of people sort of came together to draft this bill, and all sorts of people and organisations joined in. They ran events across the country discussing the bill and getting feedback from their members and group members and all this sort of thing. The
primary objective is to change the way in which the law works at the moment and process works at the moment, which mean at the moment local authorities and the National Health Service and other providers can pretty much put people where they want. What our bill proposes is that you simply won't be able to do that. You will have to take full regard of the individual's desires and wishes into account before making them a placement in residential accommodation. The bill tries to at least ensure and encourage that you know, the knowledge, the love, the affection, the care, the experience that families have isn't ignored by providers and is a full part of the process by which people are not only placed, if they have to be placed, but that knowledge is, and that involvement of the family and carers and supporters is encouraged so that the best possible provision can be provided and the best level of understanding.
Now, when I met Sarah, she told me of the tragic story of her son Connor, who died in an assessment and treatment centre in Oxford. An independent inquiry found that Connor's death could have been prevented. Staff had failed to use his parents' knowledge of his condition to make sure he was cared for safely. And not enough effort was made to understand Connor's needs as an individual, a person in his own right. His mother has ever since brilliantly campaigned for change, for a positive legacy for Connor, or Laughing Boy, as he was known. So we have worked with Sarah and her campaign team. I felt it was my responsibility to listen to them and to act. But Connor's case is sadly not unique. Too many families have told me that they felt completely ignored, that no one was listening.
If you read the draft bill and you take out the word learning disability or disabled, it's about disabled people, the fact that we're actually campaigning to give a certain set of people the same rights as everybody else is shameful. People will get behind it when they know about it, and I just think that a number of people in this country are treated so appallingly. I think that is absolutely shameful.
Yeah, I think people often forget that people with learning disabilities need to be heard as well, and that we can't make the decisions for them. I think because we are not disabled, we think that maybe we can make the best decisions for them, but they need to make their own decisions as well.
People need to be more aware, need to make adaptations and kind of look, people can do stuff, but you might need a little bit of support, yeah. Give them the time and the encouragement to do it and actually let them see what they can do.
We had a Mark Sherry in America, a professor in Toledo, sort of got his students to make a film about what happened to Connor. There's been brownies in New Zealand drawing buses, because Connor loved buses, on the floor at their brownie meeting. We've had a sociologist in Vancouver riding on buses and taking photos of a bus every day to celebrate Connor's life. These people haven't met Connor, they don't know Connor, and yet they recognise the injustice of what's happened. They recognise what a quirky and colourful individual he was, and they're acting and they're prepared to say this is wrong, you know, and join in. And I think that's absolutely amazing. It's been so heartwarming and so reassuring that so many people have just stepped up and done all these different things and got in touch and are really moved by it all and you just get it. I think that's great. I think that has meant the world to us. So my beyond wildest dreams would be that, and we're never going to achieve this in a million years, but would be that we didn't even have to talk about learning disabled people because there wouldn't need to be that division, because everybody would have a right to live where they choose. Everybody has an imagined future, and the distinction between being learning disabled and being non-learning disabled would become sort of irrelevant because it isn't an issue. That I suppose that's my wildest dream. But whether that will happen or not, I don't know. So, well, reach for the stars and see what happens, because I think Connor's up there.
I think the thing that I always reflected on was that, you know, in many respects, the world would be a lot better place if we all behaved more like Connor and less like not Connors. His sort of approach to life was so straightforward and simple, and again, not in a dismissive way, but uncomplicated, say, rather than simple. That, you know, you just sort of think, I wish I could be more like that. I wish we could all be more like that. I always used to think, well, the irony is that, you know, as a society, we don't really value people who are like Connor, but actually, you know, we should all be more like Connor and people like Connor, and the world would be a much better place, and it would be a much more inclusive place, and actually we might all enjoy it a bit more.
He showed me what life should be in a lot of ways, just by doing the things he did in the way he did them.